The morning sun broke over the Solomon Islands on April 18, 1943, casting long shadows across Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Major John Mitchell stood on the coral runway, squinting at the horizon where the Pacific Ocean met the sky in an endless blue expanse. In his hand, he clutched a decoded intelligence message that would change the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific theater. But the success of what came next wouldn't just depend on intelligence. It would depend on a radical reimagining of how American fighters engaged their opponents in the sky. For nearly 2 years, American pilots had been fighting a losing battle against the Japanese Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was a marvel of engineering, a fighter so maneuverable that it could turn inside any Allied aircraft. American pilots who tried to dogfight with Zeros rarely lived to tell the tale. The early days of the Pacific War had been brutal, with Japanese pilots dominating the skies through superior tactics and a fighter designed specifically for air combat superiority. But everything was about to change, and it would start with one man's willingness to think differently about aerial combat. Mitchell wasn't a typical commander. While other officers stuck to traditional formation flying and conventional tactics inherited from the European theater, Mitchell had spent months studying every after-action report, every debriefing, every scrap of intelligence about the Zero and how to beat it. He had reached a conclusion that many considered heretical. The answer wasn't to fight the Zero on its terms. The answer was to never fight the Zero at all, at least not the way everyone expected. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was an odd bird in the Pacific skies. With its twin boom design and center nacelle cockpit, it looked more like something from a science fiction novel than a combat aircraft. Many pilots called it the fork-tailed devil, a name the Germans had given it in North Africa. But Mitchell saw something in the P-38 that others had missed. While it couldn't turn with a Zero, while it couldn't engage in the swirling, close-quarters dogfights that characterized Pacific air combat, the P-38 had two enormous advantages: speed and altitude performance. And Mitchell was about to turn those advantages into the most effective ambush tactic the Pacific War would see. The problem was simple, but deadly. When American fighters encountered Zeros, they instinctively tried to engage in turning fights. The Zero, with its lightweight and large wing area, could turn on a dime. American fighters, heavier and designed for speed, couldn't match these turns. Pilots would enter a turn, find themselves outmaneuvered, and suddenly have a Zero on their tail, pouring machine gun and cannon fire into their aircraft. The statistics were grim. In the early months of the Pacific War, the Zero's performance had been so dominant that some American pilots refused to engage unless they had a significant numerical advantage. Mitchell knew all this. He had lost friends to Zeros. He had seen the wreckage of P-40s, F-4F Wildcats, and early P-38s torn apart by Japanese guns, but he had also noticed something crucial in the intelligence reports. Japanese pilots, for all their skill, followed predictable patterns. They relied on their turning advantage. They expected American pilots to engage in dogfights, and they became complacent when American formations looked standard and orthodox. What Mitchell proposed was so unconventional that it bordered on tactical insanity. Instead of flying in the tight, close formations that military aviation had favored since World War I, Mitchell wanted his P-38s to fly in a radically spread-out formation, not just slightly spread out, but separated by distances that would make traditional formation flying impossible. His pilots would fly in loose pairs, separated by large distances, both horizontally and vertically, creating a three-dimensional web across the sky. The other commanders thought he had lost his mind. How could pilots support each other if they were spread so far apart? How could they concentrate their firepower? How could flight leaders maintain control of their formations? Mitchell's answer was simple and revolutionary. They didn't need to fly close together because they weren't going to dogfight. They were going to ambush, and ambushes work best when the enemy doesn't know where you're coming from. The key to Mitchell's formation was energy management, a concept that would later become fundamental to fighter tactics, but was barely understood in 1943. Mitchell had realized that air combat wasn't just about maneuverability. It was about energy, the combination of speed and altitude that gave a fighter its options. A Zero might turn better, but if a P-38 was higher and faster, it could choose when and how to engage. And if the Zero pilot didn't see the P-38 coming until it was too late, all that turning ability became worthless. Here's how Mitchell's formation worked in practice. Instead of flying in a tight 4-ship or 6-ship formation, his P-38s would spread out across the sky in what he called a flexible formation. Pairs of aircraft called elements would maintain visual contact but fly with significant separation. One element might be at 25,000 feet, another at 22,000, and a third at 28,000. Horizontally, they might be separated by a mile or more. To a Japanese pilot looking up, the sky would appear nearly empty. But Mitchell's pilots would have perfect situational awareness, able to see the entire battle space and coordinate their attacks. The genius of this formation became apparent in its application. When Japanese fighters were spotted, Mitchell's pilots wouldn't rush to engage. Instead, they would maneuver to position themselves with altitude and speed advantages. The higher elements would maintain their energy reserve, acting as overwatch and ready to swoop down. The lower elements would position themselves to cut off escape routes. And when the attack came, it would come from multiple directions simultaneously, each P-38 using its speed advantage to make a single, devastating pass before climbing back to altitude. The Japanese pilots, trained to expect close formation American fighters that they could lure into turning fights, suddenly found themselves facing an entirely different threat. They would spot what looked like a lone P-38 and move to engage, only to have another P-38 come screaming down from above at over 400 miles per hour. By the time they reacted, the attacker would be climbing away beyond the Zero's ability to follow at that speed. And if they tried to pursue, another P-38 would be waiting, positioned perfectly for another high-speed pass. But developing the tactic was only half the battle. Mitchell had to train his pilots to fly this way, and that meant overcoming decades of military aviation doctrine. Fighter pilots had been trained since World War I to stick close to their wingmen, to fly tight formations that allowed for mutual support. Mitchell was asking them to abandon this security blanket and trust in a system where they might not be able to see their wingman for minutes at a time. The training began in earnest in early 1943. Mitchell would take his pilots up over the Solomon Islands and drill them relentlessly on energy management, on maintaining altitude discipline, on resisting the temptation to chase. He taught them to think in 3 dimensions, to use altitude as currency that could be traded for speed at the critical moment. He taught them patience, the ability to orbit above a fight and wait for the perfect moment to strike. One of Mitchell's key innovations was the concept of boom and zoom, though he never called it that. His pilots would dive on enemy aircraft, make a single firing pass, and then climb away, using their speed to regain altitude. If the target evaded the first pass, they wouldn't turn to pursue. They would climb back up, reassess, and set up another attack. This required discipline that went against every fighter pilot's instinct. When you see an enemy in your sights and they dodge, every fiber of your being wants to follow them, to stay in the fight. Mitchell's pilots had to learn to climb away, to trust that there would be another opportunity, and that preserving their energy advantage was more important than pressing a single attack. The P-38 was perfect for this tactic. Its 2 Allison engines gave it excellent climb performance and high-altitude capability. Its heavy armament, 450 caliber machine guns, and a 20-millimeter cannon, all mounted in the nose, meant that when a pilot did line up a shot, it was devastating. Unlike aircraft with wing-mounted guns, the P-38's weapons converged on a single point, creating a cone of fire that could tear an enemy fighter apart in a single burst. Mitchell also recognized something that would become crucial: the importance of communication and coordination. In his spread-out formation, pilots couldn't rely on visual signals or close proximity. They had to talk to each other constantly, calling out positions, threats, and opportunities. Mitchell drilled his pilots on radio discipline, on giving clear, concise reports that would allow the entire formation to maintain situational awareness. This was revolutionary. Before Mitchell, radio communications in fighter formations were minimal, used mainly for emergencies. Mitchell made constant communication the backbone of his tactical system. The first real test of Mitchell's tactics came sooner than anyone expected. That intelligence message Mitchell had been holding? It contained the flight plan of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most important military leader in the Japanese Navy. Yamamoto was flying to the Solomon Islands, and American intelligence had decoded the exact time and route of his flight. The mission to intercept him would require a long-range flight over enemy territory, precise navigation, and perfect execution, and it would rely entirely on Mitchell's unconventional formation tactics. Mitchell assembled his force, 18 P-38s, carefully selected and positioned. The mission profile was unlike anything attempted before. They would fly low over the ocean, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection, time their arrival to intercept Yamamoto's transport at exactly the right moment, and then engage the escort fighters using Mitchell's spread formation tactics. The margin for error was zero. Too early, and they would alert the Japanese. Too late, and Yamamoto would land safely. And they would be operating hundreds of miles from their base, with no possibility of reinforcement. The morning of the mission, Mitchell briefed his pilots one final time on the formation they would use. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber would lead the attack element, flying low to engage Yamamoto's transport. Mitchell himself would lead the cover element, using his flexible formation to deal with the Zero escorts. The cover element would be spread across the sky in exactly the pattern Mitchell had developed, ready to turn the Zeros' numerical advantage into a trap. The flight out was tense. 18 P-38s skimming over the Pacific at wave-top height, maintaining perfect timing and navigation. As they approached the interception point, Mitchell brought his formation up to altitude, spreading his aircraft across the sky in the pattern he had drilled into them. To any Japanese observer, the sky would have appeared clear. But Mitchell had created an invisible net, each P-38 positioned to cover a specific zone, each pilot ready to engage on his command. Then, precisely on schedule, they spotted the Japanese formation, 2 Mitsubishi Betty bombers carrying Yamamoto and his staff, escorted by 6 Zeros. The escort was led by some of Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had been flying combat missions since China, who knew every trick in the book. But they had never faced anything like Mitchell's formation. Lanphier and Barber dove on the bombers, while Mitchell's cover element engaged the Zeros. And here, the genius of Mitchell's tactics became apparent. The Zero pilots, seeing the attack on the bombers, reacted exactly as expected. They dove to intercept Lanphier and Barber, breaking formation and focusing entirely on stopping the attack on their precious cargo. But Mitchell had anticipated this. As the Zeros committed to their dive, his carefully positioned P-38s were already moving into attack positions. The first Zero pilot never saw the P-38 that came down on him from above. One moment, he was diving to protect the bombers. The next, a stream of .50 caliber rounds and cannon fire tore through his aircraft. He managed to bail out, but his fighter was already falling toward the jungle below. The second Zero fared no better. Mitchell's pilots, using their speed advantage, made devastating passes and then climbed away before the remaining Zeros could react. What happened next demonstrated the true power of Mitchell's formation. The Japanese pilots, trained and experienced, tried to turn and engage the American fighters. But every time they committed to a turn, Another P-38 would appear from a different angle, making a high-speed pass before the Zero could bring its guns to bear. The Americans weren't dogfighting. They were picking off the Zeros one by one, using speed and positioning to negate the Zero's turning advantage completely. Meanwhile, down low, Lanphier and Barber pressed their attack on Yamamoto's transport. The Betty bombers, trying to escape at treetop level, were perfect targets for the P-38's heavy firepower. Lanphier lined up on the lead bomber and fired a long burst. The Betty, its wing torn apart by cannon fire, rolled over and plunged into the jungle. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the strategic genius of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was gone. The second Betty, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, met a similar fate moments later. Above, Mitchell's formation continued to dominate the escort Zeros. The Japanese pilots, frustrated and confused by the American tactics, made increasingly desperate attempts to close and engage. But Mitchell's pilots remained disciplined, continuing to use their altitude and speed advantages. Every Zero that tried to climb to engage was met by a P-38 diving from above. Every Zero that tried to escape was intercepted by another P-38 positioned perfectly to cut them off. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 minutes. When it was over, both Betty bombers were down, taking Yamamoto and his entire staff with them. 3 of the 6 escort Zeros had been shot down, and the remaining 3 had broken off and fled. All 18 P-38s returned safely to base. It was one of the most successful aerial intercepts in military history, and it had been accomplished entirely through Mitchell's revolutionary formation tactics. But the real impact of Mitchell's tactics went far beyond this single mission. Word of the interception spread quickly through the Pacific Air Forces. Pilots began studying Mitchell's methods, and soon squadrons across the theater were adopting variations of his flexible formation. The days of tight, close formations in the Pacific were coming to an end, replaced by the energy-fighting tactics that Mitchell had pioneered. The Japanese, for their part, struggled to adapt. Their entire tactical doctrine was built around the Zero's turning advantage. Japanese pilots trained extensively in acrobatic maneuvers and close-in dogfighting. When American pilots stopped fighting that way, the Zero's advantages became liabilities. The aircraft's light weight, which made it so maneuverable, also made it fragile. A single burst from a P-38's heavy guns could tear a Zero apart. And the Zero's lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, design decisions made to maximize agility, meant that any hit was potentially fatal. Mitchell's tactics spread and evolved. Other commanders added their own refinements. The concept of the Thach weave, developed by Commander John Thatch for Navy fighters, complemented Mitchell's vertical tactics with horizontal maneuvers. The result was a complete tactical revolution in Pacific air combat. By mid-1943, American pilots were no longer afraid of the Zero. They had learned how to fight it on their terms, and the statistics began to shift dramatically in favor of the Allies. But Mitchell wasn't done innovating. He continued to refine his formation tactics throughout 1943 and 1944. He developed specific techniques for dealing with different types of Japanese aircraft. Against the nimble Zero, the vertical tactics worked perfectly. Against the faster, heavier Japanese Army fighters like the Oscar and Tony, he adjusted the formation to maintain horizontal separation as well. Against Japanese bombers, he positioned his formation to cut off escape routes and ensure that no target could reach safety. One of Mitchell's most important contributions was his emphasis on altitude discipline. In traditional formations, all aircraft flew at roughly the same altitude, maybe separated by a few thousand feet. Mitchell's formations used the full vertical extent of the atmosphere. Some elements might be at 30,000 feet, others at 20,000, creating a layered defense that could respond to threats at any altitude. This vertical stacking had another advantage. It gave his pilots an energy reserve. The high elements could dive to support the lower elements, gaining tremendous speed in the process, but the reverse wasn't true. An enemy at low altitude couldn't quickly climb to engage the high elements. Mitchell also pioneered the concept of fighting wings. Instead of organizing his formations around squadrons or other administrative units, he organized them around pairs of aircraft that would fight together. Each pair consisted of a leader and a wingman, and these pairs would maintain their partnership throughout multiple missions, developing an almost telepathic understanding of each other's tactics and tendencies. The pairs would then be organized into larger elements, but the basic fighting unit was always the two-ship element. This approach had several advantages. First, it reduced the span of control for flight leaders. Instead of trying to manage 8 or 12 individual aircraft, a flight leader only had to coordinate with other element leaders. Second, it ensured that every pilot had someone watching their back. The wingman's primary job wasn't to shoot down enemy aircraft. It was to protect the leader, to call out threats, and to ensure that no enemy could sneak up on the element. This mutual support became the foundation of American fighter tactics, and remains so to this day. The psychological impact of Mitchell's tactics on Japanese pilots was profound. In the early days of the war, Zero pilots had been supremely confident. They knew they could outturn any Allied fighter, and they had the victories to prove it. But as Mitchell's tactics spread, that confidence began to erode. Japanese pilots found themselves in situations where their skills seemed useless. They could execute perfect barrel rolls and split S maneuvers, but the American fighters wouldn't engage in that type of combat. Instead, they would appear suddenly from above, make a single devastating pass, and be gone before the Japanese pilots could react. Japanese after-action reports from this period show increasing frustration. Pilots reported that American fighters would refuse to engage in turning fights, that they would run away after making a single pass. Of course, they weren't running. They were executing exactly the tactics Mitchell had taught them, trading position for a better setup on the next attack. But to Japanese pilots, trained to value aggressive pursuit and close engagement, this seemed like cowardice. They didn't understand that they were watching a fundamental shift in aerial warfare doctrine, a shift away from World War I-style dogfighting toward energy management tactics that would define jet-age air combat. The impact on Japanese morale was significant. The Zero had been more than just a fighter aircraft to the Japanese military. It had been a symbol of Japanese technical prowess and tactical superiority. When American pilots stopped being afraid of the Zero, when they developed tactics that consistently beat it, that symbol was shattered. Japanese pilots began requesting transfers away from fighter units. New pilots, hearing stories of the American tactics, arrived at their squadrons already demoralized. Mitchell's tactics also solved a critical problem for the American war effort: the attrition rate of trained pilots. In the early months of the Pacific War, American pilot casualties had been catastrophic. Squadrons would lose half their strength in a matter of weeks. But with Mitchell's tactics, American pilots not only shot down more enemy aircraft, they also survived far more often. The ability to engage and disengage at will, to choose when and how to fight, meant that American pilots could break off if a situation turned unfavorable. This might sound like common sense, but it represented a major shift from the prevailing press-the-attack doctrine that had cost so many lives. The P-38, in Mitchell's hands, became the dominant fighter in the Pacific theater. Squadrons flying his tactics achieved incredible success. The 475th Fighter Group, which adopted Mitchell's methods extensively, produced more aces than any other group in the Pacific. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 confirmed victories, flew almost exclusively using Mitchell's energy tactics. Major Thomas McGuire, the second highest-scoring ace, did the same. These weren't lucky pilots or natural-born killers. They were highly trained professionals who had mastered Mitchell's system of tactical air combat. But Mitchell's influence extended beyond just the P-38 community. Pilots of other American fighters began adapting his tactics to their aircraft. The F-4U Corsair, introduced in 1943, was perfect for Mitchell's energy fighting approach. With excellent speed and climb rate, Corsair pilots could use the same boom and zoom tactics that made the P-38 so effective. Even the older F-6F Hellcat, designed primarily for carrier operations, incorporated elements of Mitchell's tactical thinking. Navy pilots learned to use altitude and speed advantages to avoid turning fights with Zeros, and to fight as coordinated teams rather than as individuals. The evolution of Mitchell's tactics continued throughout the war. As new Japanese aircraft appeared, Mitchell and his students adapted. When Japan introduced the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, a fast, well-armed fighter that could match American aircraft in speed and diving ability, Mitchell's formations adjusted to emphasize vertical separation even more. When Japanese pilots began using head-on attacks to negate the American altitude advantage, Mitchell taught his pilots to brake in opposite directions, then regroup and attack from different angles. One particular engagement in late 1943 demonstrated the maturity of Mitchell's tactical system. A large formation of Japanese aircraft, 60 fighters and bombers, was detected heading toward Rabaul. Mitchell led 16 P-38s to intercept. Using his flexible formation, he positioned his aircraft in a layered defense across the Japanese route. When the formations met, instead of a swirling dogfight, the engagement became a systematic destruction of the Japanese formation. Mitchell's pilots, working in coordinated pairs, picked off the Japanese aircraft one by one. The bombers, unable to reach their targets under constant attack, jettisoned their ordnance and tried to flee. The escort fighters attempting to protect the bombers were engaged by P-38s diving from above. In less than 20 minutes, 14 Japanese aircraft had been brought down, with no American losses. The remaining Japanese aircraft scattered and fled. The mission was aborted. This engagement showed several key elements of Mitchell's mature tactical system. First, the use of intelligence and positioning to set up the ambush. Mitchell didn't just react to the Japanese formation. He predicted its route and positioned his force to maximize advantage. Second, the disciplined execution of energy tactics. His pilots resisted the temptation to chase individual targets, instead maintaining formation integrity and altitude discipline. Third, the effective use of communication to coordinate multiple elements attacking from different positions. And finally, the psychological impact on the enemy. Japanese pilots facing this systematic dismantling of their formation broke and ran rather than pressing their attack. As word of Mitchell's success spread, the Army Air Force began incorporating his tactics into official training doctrine. By 1944, all fighter pilots in training learned energy management, altitude discipline, and flexible formation flying. The tight formations that had characterized early war training were replaced with looser, more flexible arrangements. Gunnery training emphasized quick, accurate shooting during high-speed passes rather than extended tracking of maneuvering targets. The impact on the air war was dramatic. In 1942, the exchange ratio between American and Japanese fighters had been roughly 1-to-1, sometimes worse for the Americans. By late 1943, after Mitchell's tactics had spread throughout the theater, the ratio had shifted to 3 or 4 to 1 in favor of the Americans. By 1944, it was 10-to-1. Japanese pilots, even experienced ones, found themselves unable to effectively engage American fighters. The Zero, once the terror of the Pacific skies, had become a liability. Mitchell's tactics also influenced aircraft design. The lessons learned from his flexible formations fed back to aircraft manufacturers. When Lockheed designed the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, they incorporated features that would support the type of energy tactics Mitchell had pioneered. High speed, good climb rate, and heavy armament became priorities. Maneuverability, while still important, was no longer the primary design consideration. But perhaps Mitchell's most important contribution was psychological. He had shown that tactical innovation could overcome technical disadvantages. In the early days of the Pacific War, American pilots had believed the Zero was unbeatable in close combat. Mitchell proved that the solution wasn't to build a fighter that could outturn the Zero. The solution was to refuse to fight that type of combat at all. This lesson, that tactics could evolve faster than technology, that smart employment of existing resources could overcome apparent enemy advantages, became a fundamental principle of American military doctrine. The flexible formation tactics that Mitchell pioneered in the P-38 remained relevant long after World War II ended. When American pilots flew F-86 Sabres against MiG-15s in Korea, they used Mitchell's energy tactics. When Israeli pilots dominated Arab air forces in the Six-Day War, they flew using principles that trace directly back to Mitchell's innovations. Even today, modern fighter pilots learn the basics of energy management and flexible formations, concepts that Mitchell helped develop in the skies over the South Pacific. Mitchell himself remained humble about his contributions. In post-war interviews, he always emphasized that he hadn't invented anything new, that he had simply applied common sense to the problem of air combat. But this modesty obscures the truly revolutionary nature of what he achieved. Mitchell took an aircraft that many considered unsuitable for Pacific combat and turned it into the dominant fighter of the theater. He took pilots who were afraid of the Zero and turned them into confident, aggressive hunters. And he did it all through tactical innovation, through a willingness to question assumptions and think differently about air combat. The story of Mitchell's weird formation tactics is ultimately a story about the power of innovative thinking in warfare. Throughout history, battles have been won not just by superior numbers or better weapons, but by commanders willing to see problems differently than their opponents. Mitchell saw that the Zero's advantages could be turned into vulnerabilities if American pilots would just refuse to fight on Japanese terms. He saw that the P-38's apparent disadvantages in maneuverability were actually advantages in speed and altitude that could be exploited. And he saw that the traditional formations inherited from earlier eras of air combat were fundamentally unsuited to the new realities of high-speed, high-altitude fighter combat. By the end of 1944, Mitchell's tactics had become so standard that they were no longer considered weird or unconventional. They were simply how fighter pilots fought in the Pacific. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to Mitchell's flexible formations. They couldn't, because countering these tactics would have required a fundamental redesign of their fighters and a complete retraining of their pilots, neither of which was possible in wartime. By the time Japanese designers produced fighters like the Kawanishi N-1K that could compete with American aircraft on equal terms, it was too late. American numerical superiority and pilot training advantages, built on Mitchell's tactical foundation, had become overwhelming. The final tally of Mitchell's career is impressive by any measure. The mission that intercepted Yamamoto alone changed the course of the Pacific War. But beyond the statistics, beyond the confirmed victories and successful missions, Mitchell's real legacy was the transformation of American fighter tactics from a defensive, reactive doctrine to an offensive, proactive one. He taught American pilots to dictate the terms of engagement, to fight when conditions favored them, and refuse combat when they didn't. These principles became fundamental to American air combat doctrine and remain so today. In the vast expanse of the Pacific theater, where distances were measured in thousands of miles and battles decided the fate of island chains and entire nations, Mitchell's contribution might seem like a small thing, just one man, one squadron, one set of tactical innovations. But warfare often turns on such small things: the right tactic at the right time, the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, the courage to try something different, even when others think you're crazy. Mitchell had all these qualities, and he used them to change the nature of air combat forever. The P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design, became one of the most successful American fighters of World War II, but its success was not inevitable. In the hands of pilots flying traditional tactics, it was a good fighter, but not a great one. In the hands of pilots trained in Mitchell's methods, it became a devastating weapon that Japanese pilots learned to fear. The difference wasn't in the aircraft. The difference was in the tactics, in the willingness to use the aircraft's strengths and avoid its weaknesses, in the discipline to execute a plan even when every instinct screamed to abandon it and dive into a turning fight. Today, when fighter pilots around the world study tactics and air combat maneuvering, they learn principles that John Mitchell helped establish in the skies over the Solomon Islands in 1943. They learn about energy management, about using altitude and speed as interchangeable currencies. They learn about flexible formations that allow mutual support while maintaining the ability to maneuver independently. They learn about the importance of communication and coordination in modern air combat. All of these lessons trace their lineage back to those hot, humid days when Mitchell stood on Henderson Field and reimagined how fighters should fight. The next time you see a documentary about World War II air combat, watch how the fighters engage. Watch how they dive from altitude, make a single pass, and climb away. Watch how they refuse to turn with enemy fighters, how they maintain speed and altitude discipline. That's Mitchell's legacy, visible decades after the war ended. The weird formation tactics that made other commanders shake their heads in disbelief became the standard that all fighter pilots follow. In the end, Mitchell's story is a reminder that in warfare, as in life, the conventional approach isn't always the best approach. Sometimes solving a problem requires stepping back and questioning every assumption, even the ones that everyone takes for granted. Mitchell questioned the assumption that fighters had to fly in tight formations. He questioned the assumption that maneuverability was the most important characteristic of a fighter aircraft. He questioned the assumption that aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft was always the right tactic, and by questioning these assumptions, he revolutionized air combat and saved countless American lives. The skies over the Pacific in 1943 were filled with danger and death, but they were also filled with innovation and the stubborn determination of men like John Mitchell, who refused to accept that the war had to be fought the way it had always been fought. His weird formation tactics, mocked by some and questioned by others, proved to be exactly what was needed to turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. And in doing so, Mitchell earned his place among the great tactical innovators of military history, a man whose ideas continue to influence air combat to this day.